The Fed is not just a failure in our terms, but a failure in its own terms and in those of the mainstream economics profession. I want to start by reminding you about the background of the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Just over 100 years ago today, 1907, we had a very terrible financial crisis, the Panic of 1907. And it was approximately, at least, in response to this crisis that the Federal Reserve System was established. Now, the Panic of 1907 was only one in a series of financial panics and crises that had beset the American economy in the years after the Civil War. It was also, of course, one of the worst. And there had been numerous attempts at reform of the monetary system up to the time of the Panic of 1907. But that panic led to the establishment of something called the National Monetary Commission. And what the National Monetary Commission was a body set up to investigate both the nature and causes of the crises that had affected the U.S. economy up to that time, and alternatives to the existing monetary system with the aim of looking for a solution. Now, I have to say, it was a loaded commission. By the time this commission was set up, it was very clear that the intentions of the people behind it, especially Nelson Aldrich, who was behind the passage of the bill in question, was that there should be an outcome favoring the establishment of a central bank. But what I want to convince you of is that today there is no less need to consider alternatives to the Fed than there was then. And indeed, the statistics suggest that we should be less happy with our monetary system now than people were in 1907. And we need something like a National Monetary Commission, though hopefully one that will really try to establish an improved system. The outcome of the National Monetary System was, of course, not that disaster, but this one, the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. And it's that system, of course, that was supposed to provide for much greater stability and a much improved monetary arrangement. Here are some elements of the Fed's mission as stated in its own publications or in the Federal Reserve Act itself. And they include, as you can see, promoting effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, moderate long-term interest rates. Elsewhere, the Fed says that it's responsible for containing financial disruptions and preventing their spread outside the financial sector. So these goals, these official goals of the Fed suggest criteria by which we should evaluate the system's success, and that's what I intend to do. I'm not going to say a whole lot about employment and unemployment for the simple reason that, as you all know, the factors that are responsible for the unemployment rate are, well, quite numerous. And the role of monetary policy in influencing unemployment is certainly important, but it's hard to separate the influence of monetary developments from other developments. Nevertheless, for what it's worth, we can ask, has the Federal Reserve era brought us an improved lower rate of employment than we saw before? And here's what the available statistics show. What I've done on these charts, I've tried to supply a vertical line indicating where the Fed was founded, and other vertical lines to show significant cutoffs from other regime changes. Most economists are very keen that we should separate the interwar years, that is, those between the establishment of the Fed and the end of World War II, from other years. That is, they like to treat the interwar period, the first decades of the Fed, as if it was practice, right? And you can understand why, especially if the goal is to apologize for the Fed, because everyone admits the interwar period was a lousy period. It was a worst period in the performance of the U.S. economy. Let's hope it stays the worst period. That certainly is true with respect to unemployment. where you can see the average rate of unemployment, mainly thanks to the Great Depression, is much higher than in any other period. But even if we focus on the post-war period, well, we find a slight improvement in the period between the end of World War II and the final abandonment of the gold standard or closing of the gold window in 1971. But since then, the unemployment rate has actually averaged a much higher level, and of course the recent developments are only going to make it worse. Now, we've got changes in unionization, minimum wage laws, a million other factors happening apart from monetary policy, which is why I don't want to put too much emphasis on this. But at least a bare comparison of the statistical record shows that we can't say that the post-Federal Reserve era has somehow ushered in a period of much lower average unemployment than before. I do think we should pay a lot more attention to the question of price stability, the behavior of prices, because everyone understands that the behavior of the price level and the inflation rate, that is something that the Federal Reserve can be held responsible for almost exclusively. With respect to preserving the purchasing power of money, the record of the Fed has been appalling. Here you see statistics for the CPI, and I didn't draw a vertical line here, but the creation of the Fed would be about there. What's interesting is if you look at the CPI between 1790 and the Fed's establishment, the difference in the price indices is about 8%. Right? You have a price index is about 100 in 1790, then the index would be 108 or so in 1914. A very trivial difference, very trivial. Now, those statistics are very, very crude and rough, but they're as good as anyone has come up with. Yes, there are alternative measures we could point to, but they all tell essentially the same story. Almost from the beginning of the Fed's establishment, and a later slide will make it clear, the value of the dollar has gone down. Right, with the notable exceptions of severe deflations in the Great Depression or interwar period. Let's look a little more closely. This is what's happened to the value of the dollar since the Fed's establishment. And so this is the purchasing power of the dollar rather than the price level, so it obviously goes in the opposite direction. And one of the things that's worth noting is that the greatest decline in the dollar has happened, or the greatest declines, have tended to coincide with periods when the Federal Reserve had the restraints imposed on it by the gold standard relaxed. This next slide will show it more clearly still. Here you have monthly inflation. And what many people are unaware of is that the worst inflation episode in the post-Civil War period in the United States was not the one in the 1970s and early 1980s. It was actually one that took place immediately after the Fed's establishment during World War I, where monthly rates, some of them, quarterly rates of inflation, if you annualize them, for some quarters were as high as 40%, right, equivalent to a 40% annual rate of inflation, which is several times higher than the highest annualized inflation rates of the 70s. Now, what's going on there, I'm referring to the inflation over here, right? What's going on there is that there's an embargo on gold exports. We didn't go off the gold standard, but the restraints on Federal Reserve money creation were relaxed considerably compared to the rest of the period prior to the Great Depression. And the same thing happens in the 70s. You get high inflation following the abandonment of the gold standard. Here you have also some inflation in connection with the Second World War. So the basic story is the more you relax the constraints on the Fed that imposed by the existence of some kind of gold standard, the more it takes advantage of it to contribute to the erosion of the purchasing power of money. Putting it the other way, to the extent that the Fed has, in some parts of its existence, resisted allowing the value of money to decline, it has done so while it has been constrained by the gold standard. So it's the gold standard we should thank for what little preservation of the purchasing power of money has taken place since the Fed's establishment, not the Fed itself.